I want to tell you about winter time and about colds and about all the ways my mother and the women in our community kept a household running through the cough and sniffle season, back before anyone in our world thought to walk into a drugstore and pick something off a shelf. Winter on a farm is no small thing. The work doesn't stop just because the weather turns hard. The animals still need tending, the wood still needs splitting, the water still needs hauling, snow or no snow. And with 8 children running in and out of a drafty farmhouse all winter long, tracking in the cold on their boots and their coats, you can imagine that colds move through our house the way they move through any large family, one child catching it from another, and then another, until it seemed like the whole house was sniffling and coughing at once. Now, I want to say to you, just as I always do, that what I'm sharing today comes from memory and from family tradition, not from any medical training. I'm an old woman telling you what my mother did in her kitchen, what was passed down to her from her own mother, and what we trusted because it had been trusted for generations before us. If you are seriously ill, if a fever runs too high, if breathing becomes difficult, if something feels truly wrong beyond the ordinary misery of a winter cold, please see a doctor. That's simply wisdom, the same wisdom my mother carried with her, knowing the difference between an ordinary cold that needed patience and home care and something more serious that needed more than her remedy box could offer. But for the everyday colds, the sniffles and coughs and sore throats that come with every winter, let me tell you what we did and how we did it and why. I think the first thing to understand about how my mother approached a cold is that she never expected it to disappear overnight, and she never tried to force it away all at once. She had a saying, one she repeated so often that all of us children knew it by heart. A cold takes the time it takes. She believed firmly that the body needed to work its own way through an illness, and that the role of all her remedies wasn't to stop that process, but to support it, to make the person comfortable while their own body did what it needed to do. I think there's real wisdom in that, even now, even with everything that's been learned since her time. She wasn't trying to fight the cold so much as she was trying to walk alongside it, easing the discomfort while nature took its course. The very first sign that a cold was settling in our house was usually a scratchy throat, and that was always the moment my mother sprang into action, because she believed firmly that catching things early made all the difference. The moment one of us complained of a throat that felt rough or sore, out would come the honey jar, and she would mix a spoonful of honey with a little warm water, sometimes with a touch of fresh lemon if we happened to have one on hand, which wasn't often in the depths of winter, but when we did, she treasured those lemons like they were made of gold. The honey, she always said, coated the throat and soothed the irritation, and there was something to that warm, sweet feeling sliding down a sore throat that did seem to bring real relief, at least for a little while. Alongside the honey, she had us gargle with warm salt water, and I remember this particular remedy with a kind of fondness now, though as a child I confess I found it rather unpleasant. She would dissolve a small amount of salt into a cup of warm water, just enough that you could taste it, but not so much that it became overwhelming. And we'd tip our heads back and gargle, over and over, several times a day if the sore throat was bad enough. The salt water, she believed, helped reduce the swelling and discomfort in the throat, drawing out some of what was causing the irritation. And whether or not the science behind it matched exactly what she believed, I do remember that it helped, at least enough that we kept doing it faithfully every winter. Now, once a cold had truly settled in, once the sniffling turned to a real thick congestion, and the cough started rattling around in the chest, that's when my mother would bring out what was, without question, the most famous remedy in our entire household, the one that every single person who ever visited our farm in wintertime came to know by smell before they even stepped through the door. I'm speaking, of course, of the onion poultice. Now, I want to describe this to you properly because I think it deserves a proper description, given how central it was to our winter survival. My mother would take a good-sized onion, slice it thinly, and warm the slices gently in a pan on the stove, not cooking them through, just warming them enough to soften and release that strong, sharp smell that would fill the entire kitchen and, frankly, much of the rest of the house as well. Once the onion slices were warm and softened, she'd wrap them in a clean cloth, fold it carefully so the onion itself wouldn't touch the skin directly, and lay this whole warm, fragrant bundle right onto the chest of whoever was suffering with the congestion. We'd lie there, sometimes for half an hour or more, with this warm, oniony poultice resting on our chest. And I'll tell you honestly, the smell was something none of us ever grew to love, but the warmth and whatever it was the onion released seemed, time and again, to loosen up that thick congestion in a way that made breathing and coughing both feel just a little bit easier. I should mention, too, that my mother believed the onion worked even when you weren't sick at all, simply by being present in the room. She kept cut onions in bowls around the house during the worst of cold and flu season, convinced that something in the air the onion released helped clear out whatever germs or sickness might be floating about. I can't tell you whether there's truth to that particular belief, but I can tell you our house smelled distinctly of onion through a good portion of every winter, and we simply accepted it as part of the season, the same way we accepted the cold itself. Let me tell you, too, about the syrup that my mother made every single autumn, without exception, year after year, because it was perhaps the most important preparation she made all year for keeping our family through the winter months. Each fall, when the elderberries along the creek had ripened and turned that deep, dark purple color, my mother and several of the older children, myself included once I was old enough, would go down with baskets and gather as many of the berries as we could find. It was, in its own way, one of my favorite days of the whole year, walking along the creek bank in the cool autumn air, picking berries until our hands were stained dark purple, talking and laughing the whole time. Back at the house, my mother would cook the berries down slowly on the stove, straining out the seeds and skins, and then sweeten the resulting dark juice with sugar or honey, whichever we had more of that particular year, simmering it further until it thickened into a proper syrup. This elderberry syrup would then be poured into jars and stored carefully, and it became our first line of defense the moment anyone in the house showed even the faintest sign of a cold coming on. A spoonful at the very first sniffle, and then a spoonful each day after that, until the cold had fully passed. My mother trusted this syrup more than almost anything else in her entire remedy box, and she made certain every single year that we had enough put up to see the whole family through to spring. For a stuffy, blocked-up nose, which I think might be one of the most miserable parts of any cold, my mother had a particular remedy that I remember vividly because of how strange it felt the very first time she introduced it to me. She would bring a bowl of hot water to the table, add a few drops of menthol or eucalyptus oil if we had it, and then have whoever was suffering lean over the bowl with a towel draped over their head, creating a kind of tent that trapped the steam close to the face. You'd breathe in deeply, again and again, letting that warm, fragrant steam work its way into your stuffed up nose and chest, and within several minutes you could usually feel things beginning to loosen and clear, at least for a little while. It wasn't a permanent fix by any means, but it brought real relief in the moment, enough to let a person breathe properly and maybe even get some decent sleep that night. Now, for the deepest, most rattling kind of cough, the sort that seemed to come from somewhere far down in the chest and kept a person awake half the night, my mother had a remedy that some families still remember even now, though it's fallen quite out of fashion, and that was a chest rub made from rendered goose fat, sometimes mixed with just a touch of camphor for extra warming power. Every autumn, after the geese had been processed for the season, my mother would render down the fat carefully, straining it into jars where it would keep through the cold months. When a deep cough set in, she'd warm a small amount of this goose grease, rub it generously onto the chest, and then cover the whole area with a flannel cloth to hold in the warmth through the night. We'd go to bed smelling faintly of that rendered fat, the flannel pressed warm against our chests, and more often than not, we'd wake feeling at least somewhat looser in the chest than we had the night before. I want to tell you, too, about something my mother did that wasn't really a remedy in the way you might think of one, but that I believe mattered every bit as much as the onion poultice or the elderberry syrup, and that was simply the matter of rest and warmth. The moment any of us showed real signs of a cold settling in deeply, she would insist, absolutely insist, that we stay indoors, stay warm, and rest as much as our young bodies would allow. This wasn't always easy to enforce, especially with the older boys who hated feeling cooped up and would sneak out to help with chores even while sick. But my mother held firm on this point more than almost any other. She believed deeply that the body needed rest to heal properly, that pushing through illness only prolonged it and risked making it worse, and she would keep whoever was sick close to the stove, wrapped in blankets, sipping warm broths and teas, for as long as it took for the worst of the illness to pass. She also believed firmly in keeping a sick person properly fed, even when appetite was poor, and her remedy for this was always the same, a simple, warm chicken broth, made from whatever chicken bones and scraps she had on hand, simmered for hours until it became rich and flavorful. She'd add a bit of garlic to the broth as well, because she held a strong belief that garlic helped fight off whatever illness was settling into the body, and she'd encourage even the most reluctant, poor-appetited child to take at least a few sips, believing that the warmth and the nourishment together did more good than any single remedy alone. I remember one particular winter when I must have been around 10 years old, when a cold swept through our entire household within the span of just a few days, taking down nearly every one of us, one after another, until my mother was the only one left standing, tending to 7 sick children and a husband who'd come down with it worse than any of us. I remember lying in bed, feverish and miserable, watching her move from room to room, bringing warm broth here, a fresh onion poultice there, gargling salt water with one child while spooning elderberry syrup into another, never once seeming to run out of patience, never once raising her voice in frustration, even though I'm certain she must have been exhausted beyond anything I understood at the time. She didn't sleep much that week, I don't think, and yet every single morning she was up before any of us, the kettle already going, fresh broth simmering, ready to begin the rounds again. I asked her once, much later, how she managed it, managed caring for an entire sick household without ever seeming to break down under the weight of it. And she told me something I've never forgotten. She said that when you truly love the people you're caring for, the tiredness simply has to wait its turn. There would be time to rest, she said, once everyone else was well again. Until then, the work simply had to be done, and so it was done. I think about that often, especially now, in my own old age, looking back on a lifetime of caring for others in one way or another. There's something in that simple, steady determination that I believe mattered every bit as much as the onion poultices and the elderberry syrup, perhaps even more. The remedies themselves, I believe, did genuine good. I trust in chamomile and elderberry and honey the same way my mother trusted in them. And I think there's real value in many of these old practices, value that holds up even against everything that's been learned and discovered since those days. But I also believe that the careful, patient, loving attention behind those remedies mattered just as much, perhaps more, than any single ingredient ever could on its own. I want to mention too, before I let you go today, that not every household in our community approached these remedies in quite the same way. Some families leaned more heavily on certain herbs, others swore by slightly different preparations, and there was always a good deal of conversation among the women at quilting bees and church gatherings about whose remedy worked best for which particular ailment. My mother would come home from these gatherings sometimes with a new idea to try, a slightly different way of preparing the onion poultice, or a neighbor's trick for making the elderberry syrup a touch sweeter without using too much precious sugar. This was knowledge that lived and breathed within the community, constantly being shared, refined, and passed along, not written down in any book that I ever saw, but carried instead in the memory and practice of generation after generation of mothers and grandmothers. I find myself wondering sometimes what will become of all this knowledge in the years ahead, now that so much has changed, now that doctors and medicines are so much more readily available than they were in my mother's time, and rightfully so. I would never wish away the genuine medical progress that has saved so many lives and eased so much suffering since those days. But I do hope that some of what I'm sharing with you today finds its way into your own home, even if only as something gentle and comforting to use alongside whatever else you might need, or simply as a story to remember, a glimpse into a kitchen and a family and a way of caring for one another that meant everything to those of us who lived it. I want to remind you, before I close, just as I always do, that these are old remedies, things passed down through a family and a community from a different time. If your cold or your flu feels severe, if a fever climbs too high, if breathing becomes difficult, or if something simply feels wrong in a way that worries you, please go and see a doctor. That is simply good sense, every bit as true now as it was when my mother knew the limits of her remedy box and wasn't too proud to seek further help when it was truly needed. But for the ordinary colds, the sniffles and coughs and sore throats that come with every winter, I hope there's something here today that brings you a little comfort, a little reminder of warm kitchens and patient hands, of onion poultices and elderberry syrup, and of a mother who never once seemed to tire of caring for the people she loved. I want to tell you, too, about how my mother decided when a cold had crossed over into something more serious, because I think that judgment, that careful watching and weighing, was perhaps the most important skill she possessed, more important even than any single remedy in her box. She had a way of checking on a sick child that I can still picture clearly. She'd lay the back of her hand against the forehead first, then move it to the cheek, then sometimes even press her lips briefly to the child's forehead, a method she trusted more than her hand alone, claiming her lips were more sensitive to changes in temperature. If the fever felt too high, if it lingered too many days without breaking, if a cough turned to a particular wheezing sound she didn't like, or if breathing seemed at all labored, that was when she'd send my father hitching up the buggy, regardless of the hour or the weather. She never hesitated in those moments, never let pride or stubbornness slow her down. And I think that willingness to recognize the limits of her own knowledge was, in its own way, just as much a part of her wisdom as any of the remedies she practiced day to day. I remember, too, the particular role that warm drinks played beyond just the elderberry syrup and the honey water, because my mother kept a whole rotation of warming teas and broths that she'd offer throughout a cold, depending on the day and what she had available. There was a ginger tea she'd make stronger than usual during a cold, believing the warming, spicy quality of the ginger helped break a fever by encouraging a bit of sweating, which she always considered a good sign that the body was working properly to push the illness out. She'd wrap whoever was sweating in extra blankets afterward, never letting them get chilled in that vulnerable state, and she'd change out damp night clothes promptly so the sweat wouldn't turn cold against the skin and cause a worse chill. There was also a particular drink she made from hot water, lemon when we had it, honey, and a small pinch of cayenne pepper, which she called her fire tonic, and which she reserved for the very worst colds, the ones that seemed to settle deep and refused to budge through ordinary measures. The cayenne gave the drink real heat, almost uncomfortably so, and I remember coughing and sputtering the first few times she gave it to me, certain she was trying to set my throat on fire rather than soothe it. But she swore by it, claiming the heat helped open up congested passages and got the blood moving in a way that helped fight off whatever illness had taken hold. And over time, I came to trust it the way she did, even if I never grew to love the taste of it. I think, too, about the particular comfort of simply being tended to during those long winter illnesses, something that went beyond any specific remedy and touched instead on the whole atmosphere my mother created around sickness in our house. She never treated illness as something shameful or something to push through with gritted teeth, the way I know some households did in those days, valuing toughness above comfort. Instead, she created a kind of gentle ceremony around being sick, a particular quilt brought down from the cedar chest, reserved only for sick days, that somehow felt different and more comforting than our everyday blankets. A particular chair pulled close to the stove, designated as the sick chair, where whoever was unwell could sit wrapped in that special quilt while the rest of the household carried on around them. Even the responsibility of choosing what story to be read aloud or what song to be sung softly while drifting toward sleep became part of the ritual of being cared for in our house. I believe now, looking back across so many years, that this ceremony of care mattered every bit as much as the onion poultices and the elderberry syrup, perhaps even more in its own quiet way. A sick child who feels truly cared for, who is wrapped in a special quilt and given a special chair and sung to softly while drifting toward sleep, carries something with them beyond the physical illness itself. A sense of being loved, of being safe, of being important enough that the whole rhythm of the household would shift, even briefly, to accommodate their comfort. I don't know how much science would credit to that kind of care, but I know what I felt as a child receiving it, and I know what I tried to recreate many years later when I had children and grandchildren of my own to tend through their own winter illnesses. There's one more story I want to share with you before I let you go today, because it stayed with me clearly across all these years. And it has to do with my own grandmother, my mother's mother, who lived with us for a time when I was quite young. She had her own particular remedy for colds that differed somewhat from my mother's, one she'd carried with her from her own girlhood, and that was a poultice made not from onion, but from mustard, mixed with flour and warm water into a paste, spread on a cloth and laid across the chest, much the way the onion poultice was used, but with a much stronger, sharper heat to it. She always warned whoever was receiving it to call out the moment it became too hot, because mustard, unlike onion, could actually burn the skin if left too long, and she'd check frequently, lifting the cloth to peek at the skin beneath, making sure no harm was being done, even as the heat worked to loosen the congestion. I remember being a little afraid of my grandmother's mustard plaster as a child, having heard from my older siblings about the sharp building heat of it. But when my turn finally came to receive one during a particularly stubborn chest cold, I found that the warmth, though strong, brought real relief, and I came away from the experience with a deep respect for my grandmother's particular knowledge, different in its details from my mother's, but rooted in that same deep well of care and generations of accumulated wisdom. The two women would sometimes discuss, quite seriously, whose remedy worked better for a given ailment, my mother defending her gentler onion poultice, my grandmother insisting that sometimes a cold needed real heat to break it apart. I never knew which of them was more correct, and I suspect the truth is that both approaches had their place, depending on the particular cold and the particular person suffering through it.